Hi everyone, it's Katey, and today I am here to share with you my top tarot decks of 2017. I've just uploaded my top oracle decks of the past year, so now it is time for those tarot decks that I just really enjoyed using this year, that I used a lot and that just really impacted me. So I wanted to start with the Dreams of Gaia Tarot, because it is the deck that kind of really brought me in to 2017. I got it on a bit of a whim, largely because I was curious after seeing it so much on social media. It wasn't a deck I was immediately drawn to, but I got a bargain and I picked it up, and as soon as it arrived I was just overwhelmingly drawn to it, and I just couldn't put it down. I'd actively made the decision in waiting for the delivery that I would not be reading the guidebook. I know that a lot of people rave on about how great the guidebook is, but I just decided that for me I didn't want to overthink this deck, so I decided to just see how it would go if I worked with it intuitively. And it blew my mind. I had so much fun. It kind of really busted me out of this little box that I feel like I might have put myself in towards the end of last year. And I just had such wonderful, powerful, incredible readings with it. It just really rocked my world, what can I say? But then come about March, when it started to cool down here, this deck just like clammed up, like it didn't want to talk to me anymore. And I moved it on, but then about 4 weeks ago, it started getting warm here, and I kept looking over on my shelf going, I need to do a reading with the Dreams of Gaia, where is it? And like forgetting that I didn't have it anymore just for a split second, and then getting quite upset. So I managed to trade for it again. I did just get the newer one. I think it's probably my most used deck of this year, even though I only had it for like 3 or 4 months of the year. That is how much I used it at the beginning of this year. So definitely Dreams of Gaia is a big favourite for me this year. Next up we have the beautiful Circo Tarot by Tightrope Press, which I'm very excited to say is about to be re-released. It's on pre-order at the moment. I think it's shipping very soon, and actually the artist has created a oracle deck as well. I think it's such a great one because it is really quite Waite Smith in a lot of ways. It's very reminiscent of what we're used to, but it does certainly have its own flavour and flair, which makes it a bit more exciting. And also just these colours are just super beautiful. So I think it makes a really great beginner deck if you're not super into the Waite, or perhaps like as a second deck. I just think it's a really accessible one. But also, like someone like me who reads a lot and has been reading for a while, it's a great one to use for clients. I read all the time. When I'm reading for other people, I use this deck a lot. And I think partly because the messages are just always so clear, very accessible, but also just people love this deck. And I've had great feedback with this deck. It's such a wonderful one. Next up is the Little Monsters Tarot. This is probably actually my least used out of the ones that I'm showing you. Just because it's not one that I use a lot, or very often, but and this is the backing. It's super cute. This was a gift from Krishna Priya, which I mean of course makes it all the more special, but this was one of the decks that was right up at the top of my wish list going into 2017. The messages that I get with this deck are just really special. I think that's the best word that I can use to describe them. I love the imagery. It really reminds me of Studio Ghibli, as well as other things that I can't quite place. I feel like this deck, it feels very nostalgic to me. It feels very sweet and innocent in a lot of ways, but there's also a lot of shadowy elements to it. So in that way, like, I think it's a really powerful and interesting deck to work with. It's not super talkative. I found that it was kind of like a quiet, introverted, dreamy child who is also very wise beyond their years, and trying to have a conversation with them. It can be beautiful and it can be interesting, and there's certainly wisdom to be found there, but you kind of have to fish through all of the it's not very clear and direct and forthright, there's a lot of poetry happening around it, if that makes sense. It's a little bit harder to grasp onto, and perhaps that's why I don't use it all the time. It's not one that I would feel I would get a lot out of just doing a quick 1 or 3 card draw, you know, as I walk out the door. This is more a deck that I want to sit down with and journal. And I've just found it really, really effective, and I've enjoyed working with it so much. And the fact that it was a gift is just the cherry on top of the cake. Next up is another kind of fairy tale cutesy deck, but in a totally different way. It's the Hezicos Tarot by Mary Griffin. And I did a review of this one finally, not too long ago, because this is a deck that I've had for a really long time. I think it was my very first indie deck. If not, it was one of my earliest indie decks. And this is the backing. This is just one of those decks that has been a favorite of mine ever since I got it. Again, it's kind of like halfway between the Circo Tarot and the Little Monsters for me, in that it's a little bit fairy tale, it's a little bit whimsical and dreamy, but it's also very clear. And it can be quite cheeky and mischievous too. It certainly has like a fae energy attached to it, I think, in terms of how it speaks to me anyway. And I love the colours. The colours in this deck are just glorious. Love it. And I love too that, you know, like the Ten of Swords that we just saw, it doesn't shy away from some of those harder cards. I think when you first see this deck, it looks like it almost could. It looks like it could be too pastel-y and too cutesy, but I don't find that at all. I think it's a really well-rounded deck. Next is another one of those much-loved decks that I've had for a while and use all of the time and have loved for a long time. It's a Fantastic Menagerie by Bubba Studios, or originally Magic Realist Press, or whatever they were called back then. This is the backing. This is my second favourite tarot deck that I've ever owned. It's very, I think, satirical and sharp-tongued. Those sort of things, those sort of words really, I think, are appropriate when describing this deck. I think what it does really well, this deck, is kind of throwing in your face the fact that those beliefs and values and ethics that you hold really, really true, as if they are fact. You know, in many cases they aren't. You know, not everybody thinks and believes the same way you do, and this deck is really good at kind of putting that right in front of you and being like, hey, where does this stuff come from? Is it actually true, or is it just something you've learned, or just a belief that you've assumed because it was easy and now it's so ingrained? I don't know. This deck can really get to the bottom of some stuff, I think, because it disarms you with its humor, with its wit. And so this deck is so good. I love it. And the next one, while I'm mentioning my second favorite, I might as well mention my favorite deck, is the Gill Tarot. This is a very special deck to me. It's my #1 forever deck, soul deck, whatever you want to call it. And I knew it from the instant that I saw it online. It was love at first sight. Although I will say that I haven't used this deck a lot this year. It definitely played a bigger, more active role in my practice last year. But it's still, that doesn't mean that it's any less important, if that makes sense. I did use this deck for my year ahead reading, or my 2018 reading, which wasn't, I don't do like the 12-month reading anymore. I do my own spread that I made up last year. And I use this deck for that. So I feel like in many ways, because of that, I've been working with the energy of this deck all year, really consistently, because it played such a big part in me kind of transitioning and establishing, you know, the groundwork that I was going to start from. It's hard for me to make any favorites list without throwing the Gill Tarot in, and it's remained a really important one, even if it's been less obviously actively present. Next up is another old favorite. It's the Menagerie. This is the Llewellyn edition, which I'm sharing because this is the edition that I've had for most of the year, and therefore the one that I've worked with the most, and it is in order because I've just done the comparison video between the Llewellyn edition and the self-published. But this is always one of my most used because it is such a workhorse for me. I think of all of the decks, I think this is the most approachable, or accessible, I think would be the better word. This deck is absolutely accessible because Menagerie has done such a fabulous job of absolutely maintaining the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith meaning and energy of the cards, or like feeling of the cards, meanings of the cards, but stripped back the esoteric occult imagery and symbolism. So it's absolutely a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, just without all of those layers that make those more traditional sort of decks like the Rider-Waite-Smith and Thoth feel inaccessible, feel overwhelming to beginners. This deck is the Rider-Waite-Smith without all of that. And that's what I love so much about it. And this is a deck that I use a lot when I'm reading for clients, but also that I use a lot for myself, especially when I'm finding myself overthinking things. I think because it doesn't have all those extra layers of symbolism and imagery, you can go into the layers of the meaning, but it doesn't have all of those layered on top, if that makes sense. Because you don't have to go through all of that, someone like me who's very much in their head a lot of the time, this deck can really kind of help me just get back to basics and just absorb the message of the cards rather than trying to overthink the symbolism. The cards really do kind of, you can imagine them starting to move and tell a story like in an old children's book. And so in that way, they're not only accessible in terms of the messages if we're reading tarot, it's also accessible, I think, just for our subconscious and our imagination. So it's a fabulous, well-rounded deck that I use a lot for a lot of different things. Next is Stella's Tarot. This is another one that I've had for a few years, and when I first got it, it was a hugely impactful deck for me. It jumped right up the top of my list for a favorite deck that I knew was just really important to me in my journey. I actually have 2 copies now. I have another copy that is trimmed. This is the intact version. And it kind of went a little bit quiet for me last year, and for, you know, the first half of this year. I didn't really, I mean, I still loved it and I pulled it out occasionally, but it wasn't a deck that I found myself reaching for. But then when I got this second copy, I kind of fell in love with my first copy in a weird sort of way, and I couldn't put it down. I could not put it down, and it just felt like coming home to a best friend that I haven't seen in a few years. So I'm so glad that the Stella's Tarot is back in my life because it was such an important one. And it's just a lot of fun to read with. I just really enjoy it. I just have a really great relationship with it that's not only really powerful and impactful in terms of the messages that I get, but it's just also really fun. And I love that about tarot, when we can just have fun. I think that's an important part of the whole process, not to take yourself or the cards too seriously. And that's something that Stella's Tarot has certainly taught me. I won't go on too long about this one, but the Centennial. The Centennial edition, the Smith Waite by US Games. This is just such a great deck. It's an absolute workhorse for me. It's one that I go to, I reach for, I always have on my desk ready, because I think, I mean, one, it's just helpful to have a Rider-Waite-Smith around for, I often just want to reach out and have a look at a card when I'm comparing different cards. Like, I just think the Rider-Waite-Smith is such a great base, but also because it's a really great deck to read with. I think it's so reliable, and also I just really love this edition. I have a few editions, but this is the one that I feel comfortable throwing in my bag or whatever, taking it on holidays. And I think it's a really beautiful edition too. The colours are lovely and the cardstock's awesome. Yeah, this one's got to be in my top favourites of this year. Okay, we just have a couple left. Let's talk about the World Spirit Tarot. Oh, I love this deck. This deck is an absolute gem. I love this deck. This is another one that I use a lot when I'm reading for clients, just because I think it is really powerful. Kind of gives you that kick up the bum in a loving way. Ultimately, for me, this deck just feels like such a celebration. It just feels like it wants to teach you how to love yourself and your body and this earthly experience. I think so often, especially in these spiritual New Age communities, we can kind of fall into the trap, I think, of placing more importance on the spiritual over the mundane, as if there is nothing spiritual about the mundane and our whole purpose is to transcend and get away from it. I think that's a very Christian and monotheistic kind of hang up that we've maintained, and perhaps it comes from other areas as well, but that's what it reminds me of. And I think this deck is just saying no, it's the opposite. This earthly experience, this human body of yours is absolutely sacred. Everything that it can do, the sensuality of it is sacred. Honor it, experience it, enjoy it, revel in it. That's what this deck is to me. It is an absolute celebration of our physicality, of our experience exactly as we are. And I love it. I think it's such an empowering, beautiful deck. And my final big tarot deck for 2017 was the Sasuraibito, or the Sassy Burrito. This deck has just been a huge one for me, and I wasn't expecting that. I nearly didn't even get this deck. I wasn't sure that this would be a deck for me at all. And I ended up getting it basically because I wanted a different deck and I figured I'd save on shipping. And I was curious, but I was pretty sure I would end up trading it. I thought it would be a bit fickle, a bit too light for me. Not in terms of light and shadow, but in terms of not being meaty enough, I guess, is what I was thinking. But no, I was very, very wrong. The second I pulled this out of the box, I was taken. And it was one of those decks that I just immediately started shuffling and throwing cards out and reading. And within the first week of owning it, I was reading for clients with this deck. And it just always felt like it was speaking to me. I just think it has such a clarity of voice, and its messages are always so direct. I've really found myself reading this deck very intuitively, very much based off the imagery. The imagery itself really speaks to me. And I've just had such a good time with this deck. I think it's really beautiful. Love this card. The cups especially just really get me. I think they're absolutely stunning. It's just such a fun, interesting deck, and a beautiful one too. And it's a very evocative deck. Cards like this, you just get like an immediate emotional, physical reaction to of, oh, I know that feeling. And I just think there's something really powerful and special about that. I just think it's so beautiful too. The colors that the artists use, I just think really kind of aid in conveying that, the emotion of these cards, and I think they're just done really, really well. And I love them. I love this deck. This has probably been my most exciting, unexpected tarot experience of this year as regards to different decks that I've worked with. Was not expecting to love this deck as much as I do, and it just immediately jumped up right up to the top of that list of decks that I loved working with and that I know are going to hang around for quite a while. But that is all from me. These were the tarot decks of 2017 that I really, really enjoyed. Now, I know I'm going to get this question. This isn't my top favorites of all time. There are a couple of decks like the Spiral Tarot, things like that, the Liminal, that are still some of my favorite decks. They haven't gone anywhere, they're over there, but I tried to kind of keep this to around 10 decks. That's what I aim for, give or take. And these are, you know, just because a deck hasn't been super prevalent for me this year doesn't mean that it hasn't been in the past and it won't be in the future. It doesn't mean that I haven't been using it this year. It's just that these are the ones that I found myself reaching for time and time again, and that I was having really great experiences with above and beyond this year. Thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear what your favorite tarot decks have been this year, those ones that have just been really powerful and impactful and useful, whatever it is that you judge this by. I would love to hear in the comments below, and I will do my best to get back to you. And until next time, so much love. Bye.